Hello, everyone. I will be presenting this working paper called Poverty Dynamics and the Case of Bangladesh. This is part of the webinar series of the Global Development Institute. And you can check the whole content of this working paper. It's under this name, Poverty Dynamics in Bangladesh. It's a report that I wrote in collaboration with Oxford Policy Management, and it's a whole initiative by different groups, the World Bank and other universities, called Data and Evidence to End Extreme Poverty. Well, this is the inclusion criteria. I will not go that much into the details of this. How can I do this small? Okay. So these are the keywords that I look at Google Scholar. Poverty, the main keyword is Bangladesh, and then different keywords, poverty dynamics, poverty drivers, interrupters. And I found 263 research papers. From after a screening process, I identified 87 studies that could provide insights about poverty dynamics in Bangladesh. And at the end, I just picked 52 to be presented in the literature review. These are the topics that I will present. Each of them, I would like to dedicate around 8 to 10 minutes. Let's see if I can make it. So I will start with poverty dynamics, and I will go very briefly in a few slides to introduce all these concepts and what is poverty dynamics. So first, this is the poverty headcount ratio in Bangladesh in national poverty lines. It showed that in the 2000, almost 50% of the population in Bangladesh was living in poverty, and in 2022, it was 18%. Something similar if we use the poverty headcount ratio at $2.15, which is a way to compare countries. So when you do this kind of analysis known as static analysis of poverty, you can see reductions in poverty depending on the methodology. In one case, 30 percentage points. In other cases, 23 percentage points. So it basically studied the evolution of poverty rates across time. And well, the figures showed that it has been reduced, the poverty rates in Bangladesh. But the interesting thing is that there is an emerging field which is trying to use a dynamic approach to study poverty. To understand how people is experiencing poverty trajectories across time. So this is a very good figure to illustrate this. So for example, you can see here people that is considered chronic poor across time because they are always below the poverty line, regardless of the time that you're considering, not the study period. So then you have people that are transient poor. So you analyze people across time, and you realize that there are people that are occasionally falling into poverty or churning poor, which are above and below across time. And this is known as transient poor. And we also have the non-poor or the never poor, which they are always above the poverty line. And this is was taken from Poole, which is a researcher at the University of Manchester. Now, so this is a nice figure that starts illustrating the idea of poverty dynamics. So it shows that from 2011 to 2015, they were, for example, 15% of people that move out of poverty, which is known as poverty escapes or upward mobility. There are also people that experience 10% of people, 9 to 10% of people that experience poverty descent or downward mobility, and 16% that were chronic poor in Bangladesh, And according to this study, 68% were never poor. I already introduced all these concepts, but one of the most interesting things of analyzing poverty dynamics is the vulnerability to poverty. And this figure illustrates the concept. I just made this myself to illustrate the idea. So you have people that are below the national poverty line, which are considered poor, and you have people that are above the poverty line, which are the non-poor. But between the non-poor, there are people that are less vulnerable to poverty or more vulnerable to poverty. So people that is very close to the poverty line are more vulnerable to poverty than those above in the income distribution. So why is it relevant to study and measure vulnerability to poverty? Well, first, the World Bank highlighted that more than half of the Bangladeshi population was considered vulnerable to poverty in 2016. Another study also mentioned that 39% of Bangladeshi households were turning into poverty in and out, suggesting a high vulnerability to poverty, while another study estimated that 82% of the population in Bangladesh lived in poverty condition during the COVID pandemic due to the high vulnerability to poverty. So this graph illustrates the rise of poverty during the pandemic. It seems that it has been reduced if we consider 2022, but this illustrates that even when Bangladesh is reducing poverty, there is still a lot of people that are very vulnerable to fall into poverty. So this is why it is important to understand poverty dynamics, vulnerability to poverty, and all these concepts. Now, I will explain the concept of structural transformation as an economist. This is one of my favorite sections. It's my favorite section, actually, and I will show you some of the interesting results that I found here. So structural transformation in development economics is known as the transition of labor-intensive activities with low productivity rates to skill-intensive activities and with higher productivity rates. And the most popular example of this structural transformation process is when a country evolves from being a mainly agricultural country to become an economy that is industrial and has service activities. And the conventional theory of the structural transformation is that when this is happening, there is usually when structural transformation is happening, there is a transition that tends to lead to higher economic growth, higher salaries for the benefit population, and lower poverty rates. This is the structural transformation of Bangladesh between 1991 and 2021. And I highlighted some things that I found interesting. So, for example, almost 2/3 of the labor force in Bangladesh were in agriculture in 1991. And in 2021, it was only 1/3, almost a little bit more than 1/3. So there has been a reduction of agricultural activities in Bangladesh, and while the industrial and the service sector has been increasing. So, for example, in 1991, 12% of the labor force in Bangladesh was working in industrial activities, and in 2021 is 21%. Something similar happened. There was a service sector expansion in Bangladesh. Only 23% of the labor force was involved in service activities, and now, since 2008, the service sector is now bigger than the agricultural sector. So, also, while in 1991, 64% of the population was in agriculture, in 2021, now 63% are not in agricultural activities. So this is an example of what is the structural transformation of the economy, or an example of what is it. Now, we'll talk about two things about the structural transformation: the role of non-agricultural activities and the role of agricultural activities. So I will start with the role of non-agricultural activities. This is a picture of the garments industry in Bangladesh. And one of the most frequent explanations of poverty decline in Bangladesh is that a lot of people during the last decades got jobs outside the agricultural sector, which is why I showed you in the previous figure. For example, a main driver of poverty reduction was the accelerated growth of the garments industry. This paper concluded that the expansion of the garment industry contributed to 3/4 of the total growth of income per capita between 1974 and 2011. So it's saying that 3/4 of the total growth of income per capita comes from the garments industry. Now, from 2010 to 2016, this paper found that 90% of poverty reduction in Bangladesh occurred in rural areas, and it was driven by the non-agricultural sectors, which is the industry and the service sector. So these are papers that have a similar view. They say that, for example, this one says that one of the keys to achieve sustained poverty escapes. Sustained poverty escapes is a concept that tries to refers to the situation where people stay out of poverty. So they manage to not live in vulnerability or highly vulnerability. So this is a sustained poverty escape. And this happens when they complement agricultural activities with non-farm incomes, because this diversify risks and reduce vulnerability. These other papers show that in non-farm sectors, the engagements in non-farm sectors, which is industry and services, prevents households from falling into poverty. And this last one is something similar. People living in chronic poverty tend to concentrate their assets and labor around agriculture, while rural populations that were not chronic poor had sources of income that were not related to the agricultural sector. So all this is the standard view of economics, saying that engagement in industry and service activities helps to reduce poverty in a country. But I found some other papers that showed a very different point of view. They say that the agricultural sector in poverty reduction has been neglected by researchers, and they started showing some evidence about the role of agriculture to alleviate poverty. For example, this paper made a huge statement saying that the agricultural sector has been driving poverty reduction in Bangladesh since the 2000s. The argument is that this sector is becoming more capital intensive, and the technological progress within the agricultural sector is not only increasing productivity, but also generating higher earnings in this sector. They found that in 2010, 87% of the household relied on agriculture for at least part of their income. And they suggested that agricultural activities are part of the strategy of Bangladeshi households to escape from poverty. And this is the source of this paper. This other paper by Gil and Ceballos examined the spatial variation of sectoral growth in agriculture, industry, and services to determine which sector was driving poverty reduction in Bangladesh between 2000 and 2016. They found that poverty was reduced faster in districts where the growth of agricultural output and the number of manufacturing firms was the highest. On the other side, they found that variations in the growth rate of the service sector is not explaining difference in poverty reduction across districts in Bangladesh. And to confirm the importance of the agricultural sector, they use weather data for each district and each year as an instrument to establish a causal relationship between growth in the agricultural output and poverty reduction in Bangladesh. And this is another very interesting paper. They said that the poverty reduction can vary. The relevance of each economic sector on poverty reduction can depend on the period or years that you're analyzing. For example, they say that from 2000 to 2005, most of the poverty decline was driven by non-farm wages. But in 2005 to 2010, the wage increases in agriculture play a major role in poverty reduction. So in 1 year, it was the industrial and the service sector, the industrial and the service sector, while in the other years, it was the agricultural sector. Then I found this very interesting paper. It says that between 2007 and 2008, there was a food crisis in Bangladesh that pushed more than 13 million people to poverty due to the rising food prices. The probabilities of living in poverty conditions in Bangladesh during these years, what they found is that if you compare their likelihood of living in poverty between households that relied on agricultural activities, their likelihood of being poor was particularly high in 2008, but it reduced a lot in 2004, and it reduced a lot in 2008. Why? Because they found that during the food crisis, those households that relied on agricultural activities benefit a lot due to higher earnings or self-consumption of food. So to finish this section, this reminds me of a book that I read during my master's. There's a section in this book called Evolving Perspective on the role of agriculture in economic growth and poverty alleviation. And they said that there is a paradigm in development economics which economists tend to think that agricultural sector has very little to contribute to the process of economic growth and poverty alleviation. And so this is based on the structural transformation process, and is from Arthur Lewis, not the founder of the building, but how do you say the word? Well, he has the name of our building and Nobel Prize here from Manchester. So he developed this theory, but Perkins and others consider that some economists has misinterpreted the words of Arthur Lewis. He said that Arthur Lewis said that it is not profitable to produce a growing volume of manufactures unless agricultural production is growing simultaneously. I will skip this one, but it's reduced into this sentence. It says that in the absence of increasing agricultural productivity, the withdrawal of labor from agriculture will eventually or immediately reduce food supply and increase food prices. I don't know if this is related to what happened in Bangladesh in 2007 or 2008, but it's an interesting view. If you just want to take people out of agriculture to industrial services without making the agricultural sector productive, you can at the end have a shortage of food or a food crisis at some point. This is an interesting point of view. But the main idea is that in this section, I showed that the role of agriculture in poverty reduction has been kind of neglected, and it's also an interesting research topic. So, okay, now I will go to the concept of enabling environment. This is also an interesting concept. So basically, the concept of enabling environment refers to things that are out of the responsibility of the people, but that affect their probabilities of escaping from poverty. Okay, and there are different things that affect their probabilities of escaping from poverty. For example, if they have political stability, if in their country or if in their area there is enough absence of conflicts, if the country is experiencing economic growth, if there is resilience to climate shocks, if there is universal health coverage, if there are few gender norms, and if there is enough infrastructure, it will be easier for people to escape from poverty. On the other side, if you combine this in the negative side, then it will be more difficult for them to escape from poverty. From all these factors, I will just explore a few. One of them is gender norms. So, for example, this paper found that Bangladeshi households living in chronic poverty tend to have high levels of women disempowerment. This other paper conducted a focus group discussion and reported that women from Bangladesh tend to testify that they need their husband's permission to work or generate income, and that they cannot work outside their home for fear of losing their reputation and respect. So this shows that in certain regions of Bangladesh, there is still a lot of gender norms. So, and what this concept of enabling environment tries to refers to is that if you have strong gender norms, it will be more difficult for people to live out of poverty. So another dimension is the infrastructure. This paper showed that, for example, if you have good rural infrastructure and access to electricity, this can help to increase productivity and reduce poverty in Bangladesh. Households that are more likely to live in persistent poverty are those that do not have access to electricity. And they also highlighted that jobs in industry and services, which tend to have better salaries, are in the best communicated areas of Bangladesh. So if you live in a less communicated area, it will be more difficult for you to get a salary that takes you out of poverty. Finally, I will talk a little bit about two different types of shocks. One of them is called idiosyncratic shocks, and the other one is covariant shocks. So idiosyncratic shocks refers to household-specific problems. For example, the death of the primary income earner, injuries, chronic illness, or unemployment, while covariant shocks refers to community-level shocks, which are, for example, natural disasters, cyclones, droughts, epidemics. Okay? So the household shocks, what this paper found is that household shocks seems to have relatively higher impact on well-endowed households, while community shocks, also known as covariant shocks, tend to have a relatively higher impact in poorer and less educated households. Finally, the idiosyncratic shows that the shocks at the household level seems to have a greater impact on household consumption vulnerability compared to covariant shocks. And here's another researcher at the University of Manchester. This is MATAB supervisor, actually, co-supervisor. Bangladesh. So I will talk a little bit about climate shocks. Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable countries to the adverse effects of climate change, especially in the densely populated coastal areas of the country. So, for example, this paper found that as a consequence of floods, rural poor communities faced job losses and 2/3 of their income was reduced. And they also explained that this limits their ability to respond and recover from subsequent floods. Another thing that appeared in this topic of climate shocks in Bangladesh is salinity intrusion, which is when you when salt water infiltrates into drinkable water, let's say, or freshwater systems. So it says that salinity is a poverty driver in some areas of Bangladesh, since it caused the loss of crops and changes in livelihood and employment. Another paper showed that salinity intrusion affects human capital because it reduces access to safe water for cooking, taking a shower, and other sanitary purposes. And finally, the last paper by Monirul, explained that cyclones started a land degradation process due to the salinity in the cropping fields, and this affected household infrastructure, drinking water, and sanitation. So this is another interesting topic, salinity intrusion, and how it is affecting people in Bangladesh, especially in the coastal areas. And then I think this is the last from this section is health shocks. Mutir and others asked Bangladeshi household heads that experienced poverty descents. So basically they were not poor and they start being poor, and they asked them the main reasons why they experienced this downward mobility. One of the answers was that they lost crops due to natural disasters. But the other one was high medical costs in Bangladesh. They found that 24% of rural households were affected by medical expenses associated with hospitalizations, long illness, and regular use of medications.
Yes. Do you know what was the cause of the hospitalization, long illness, and regular use of medication in rural households?
No. I mean, I don't remember because, I don't remember. I just highlighted the main things of the paper, but...
And changing the use of land due to use of extensive agriculture and pesticides and stuff? No.
I mean, could be, I don't know. Yeah, it could be, but the I don't remember if I put something about what is. Let me see. I don't remember if I cover something of this, but let's see.
For the sake of maintaining the time, is it okay if we can take all the questions towards the end? So if we have any bigger question, we'll take it towards the end. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So from this paper made by Kant and others, they found that out-of-pocket payments is one of the recurrent strategies to deal with unpredictable expenses, health expenses. They found that 14% of Bangladeshi households incurred in catastrophic health expenditures. And they also found that this was more common in rural areas than in urban areas. And finally, they concluded that around 3.5% of total Bangladeshi population fell into poverty annually due to out-of-pocket payments related to health costs, and corresponding to 5% to 5 million people falling into poverty in Bangladesh due to these health shocks. And okay, I will move on to the last section, asset holdings. This is another section of the report which explores how different kind of assets affects your probability of escaping from poverty or remain in poverty. So, for example, physical capital refers to agricultural machinery and livestock, if certain people in Bangladesh have access to this technology or not, or to livestock, to cows, for example. Natural capital refers to land holdings. If people have access to land and they can cultivate this land. Financial capital refers to, for example, savings, bank accounts, access to credit. Social capital refers to personal networks, and human capital refers to education, nutrition, and skill acquisition. So these are different kind of capital dimensions. I will not cover all of them. I will just cover two: natural capital, land holdings, and social capital and personal networks of. I will explain what is personal network. So, in terms of land holdings, for example, this paper found that farming households with more land holdings are less likely to fall into poverty. This is a standard result. If you have more land holdings, you're less likely to fall into poverty, basically. This other paper says owning land, and this is another important thing, or having access to it, even if it's not yours, determines who can escape from poverty in Bangladesh, or is a determinant, not the only determinant, but one of the determinants. This other paper found that households with higher size land have a bigger propensity to save and accumulate producing assets in comparison with those that have less land. And for me, this is a very interesting result. So the Islam in 2014 found that what matters is not if you own land, but basically the size of the land and if you can cultivate there. So they say that regardless of if the land is borrowed or is yours, the size of the land is what matters, not the ownership of the land. And I will now explore the social capital dimension. This is actually Matab is working a little bit on this topic. So some researchers have analyzed the contribution of migration and remittances to poverty reduction in Bangladesh. This figure shows how remittances and how receiving money from abroad has been increasing in Bangladesh. It was only 5% of household incomes in Bangladesh. And in 2008, it was already 23% compared to farm income and non-farm income. Is the one that is increasing. And this is an interesting discussion that I found when I was reading these papers. One question is rural to urban migration within Bangladesh contributing to poverty reduction in the country? These researchers made an experiment. They introduced mobile banking to very poor households and family members who migrated to urban areas. And the objective was that if you modernize the traditional ways of transfer money and facilitate the financial connection between urban and rural areas, it will help to reduce poverty. The results after 1 year of experiment is that urban to rural remittances within Bangladesh increased by 26%, and rural consumption increased 7.5%. They also found that rural households borrow less money, they save more, they use the money to send more migrants to urban areas, and they consume more during the lean season. And they also found that urban migrants experience higher savings after migrating. They experience less poverty, and they reported, but for some reason, and I think they didn't delve into this, but they reported worse health. This may be related with what you were saying. I don't know exactly the drivers of health. Now, there's another paper arguing that it is not necessarily happening this way. They say that rural to urban migration can become a poverty trap for national migrants in Bangladesh. They say that rural migrants moving to big cities are quickly absorbed by the informal sector, which is usually low-skill occupations, and it offers very little scope to develop more skills and get better jobs. They said that a big percentage of their income is dedicated to healthcare expenditures. So this might be related with the other part that said that urban migrants are experiencing worse health outcomes. They also found that they spend a lot of money in healthcare expenditures, education, transportation, and even bribes to access certain services. And they consider that all these factors traps them in the informal sector, and it offers them very low possibilities of having a better job and higher remunerations in the future. And finally, this paper by Banks provided interesting insights about the difficulties that migrants face to have a formal job in urban areas. She found that getting a formal job in Dhaka with better salaries and other benefits is not usually based on the education or the experience of the applicant, but rather on their social connection. But I was trying to explain about personal networks and social connections is kind of related. It's a dimension, a capital dimension known as social capital. So they say that migrants living in low-income neighborhoods, which are known as bustis, is this correct? Bustis, need to have a contact, which is known as MAM. Yes?
Okay.
Mamu, yes. That helps them to connect. They connect people. Yeah, they influence and connect people to formal jobs with higher salaries and a formal contract. And she said that higher income opportunities are limited to well-connected busty households, while busty households without social connections usually work in the informal sector. And she is also a researcher at the University of Manchester. So international migration, this is something that Matab is studying, and I think there is more consensus on this topic. They said, for example, that districts with a higher level international migrants show a high reduction of poverty. Households with migrants show a higher level of food consumption, higher medical and education expenditures, and better housing and sanitation compared to households without migrants. Households are also less likely to fall into poverty if they had greater access to overseas migrant labor markets. And this is interesting. This paper found that the inflow of remittances from unskilled international workers, not skilled, but unskilled, is one of the reasons behind the real wage escalation of Bangladesh. So they are saying that remittances are increasing the wages in Bangladesh. So the conclusion of this subsection about social connection is that family-based social capital in form of remittances can help to improve living standards at the household level, but also at the national level. And that social capital in the form of social connections are relevant to determine the chances of getting a better paid occupation. So I think I had a very short section of future research. These are some of the topics that I consider that should be explored in the future. If we have 2 minutes, I finish.
Yeah, sure.
Great. So, for example, a research area that I consider that should be explored in the future is the drivers of rising agricultural wages in Bangladesh. It could be that is technological changes and higher productivity within agriculture, according to the literature. Some others consider that is the industry and the construction sector, which is rising the agricultural wages in Bangladesh. The previous paper argued that it might be remittances. So it could be interesting to explore these factors and determine which one is the most important one. Another one is what I explained, the rural to urban migration, and if it's contributed or not to poverty reduction. This one is, in my opinion, particularly important after conducting the literature review, is urban poverty in Bangladesh. And for example, this analysis from the World Bank highlighted that Bangladesh has experienced very little poverty reduction in urban areas during recent years. Poverty is increasing in urban areas, especially in the largest cities of Bangladesh. And finally, Raman and Hill also highlighted that according to their projections, in 2030, more than half of the poor households will be living in urban areas of Bangladesh. When I conducted the literature review, it was surprising for me that only 5 or 4 made a deep analysis of urban poverty in Bangladesh. And this paper by Hack or Gates argues that argues that there is a rural bias in Bangladesh because the government gives little attention to the urban poor and they concentrate resources on programs to reduce poverty in rural areas. So I will finish here. I have this is something that I was talking to Nabila and it's the final slide. So I found this interesting. This paper by Scott and Diwakar argues that policymakers should differentiate about the purpose and the effectiveness of social programs depending on the poverty situation of the population. So, for example, they study social assistance and social insurance programs, and what they found is that social assistance is more useful for the poorest households, and social insurance should be targeted to vulnerable households to prevent poverty descent. So what they concluded is that it may not be appropriate to use the same social protection instruments to tackle chronic poverty and to prevent impoverishment. You should design social programs with different purposes and target them to specific populations to avoid poverty descent or to lift them out of poverty. So this is it. I translated this. I don't know if it's correct. Yes. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Isaac. Thank you for the presentation.